Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Observing Dickinson's Herbarium alongside her poetry suggests that these are not two separate expressions of the same mind, but two manifestations of a shared intellectual practice. Pressing flowers onto paper and arranging words on a page emerge as parallel gestures, then both preserve ephemeral experiences while simultaneously transforming them into new forms of knowledge. In each case, classification becomes an imaginative act instead of a merely scientific one. Dickinson does not only simply record nature, she reorganizes it, questions it, and allows it to challenge the categories through which humans attempt to understand the living world. And I would like to leave you with one final thought. When Susan Gilbert Dickinson remembered Emily after her death, she praised her treasures of fruit and flowers while her poetry went largely unmentioned. And more than a century later, we no longer have to choose between those two, Emily the gardener and the poet, because they were never separate identities. They were complementary ways of engaging with the world, each rooted in the same discipline of careful observation and the same conviction that even the smallest flower, when truly attended to, has the power to transform how we see nature, language, and ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for such a beautiful take on Dickinson's poetic and naturalistic approach. Wonderful. The third speaker, Mila, her topic is mechanic feet, rhizomic feet, reading Fascicles 18 and 23 to model garden organization in Dickinson's Fascicle project. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, I can get started. I do have a presentation, so I'm going to try and share my screen, and then we can get moving. Okay, is everybody able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So, oh. Okay, great. So I'll just have this here, and then I'll pull my paper up on another tab. So thank you for the introduction, and thanks to my fellow panelists for their really insightful presentations. Alejandra, I think ours are going to be particularly in synergy. I'm kind of starting us at the herbarium and then moving toward the living garden. But I think we definitely have some overlapping ideas, which is really exciting. So I will just get started. My paper is entitled Mechanic Feet, Rhizomic Feet, Reading Fascicles 18 and 23 to Model Garden Organization in Emily Dickinson's Fascicle Project. All right, so when she was 10 years old, Emily Dickinson encountered scholar Almira Lincoln Phelps' textbook, Familiar Lectures on Botany, and decided to compile her own journal of plant clippings, now called her Herbarium. It was the early 1840s. Dickinson was a precocious, sociable, and bookish adolescent, still over a decade away from the decision to make poetry her primary focus. Hence, the first book completed by this stalwart of American verse was not one of self-composed poetry, but of gathered plants. If the Herbarium points to Dickinson's later interest in bookmaking, it also seems to foreshadow the limits of her posthumous reputation. Though inspired by reading, these pressed plant cuttings provide fodder for a vision of petite feminine whimsy that dovetails Dickinson's modern pop cultural persona. For over 100 years, Dickinson's many editors arranged her poems not according to the careful groupings she herself determined, but as amalgamations of individual poems, cut at the stems and pasted into volumes which were marketed as comprehensive. In her writing, as in her herbarium, casual readers romanticized fragmentation, cutting and analyzing Dickinson's corpus into ever smaller segments. Though substantial scholarly effort has been expended to establish Dickinson's weighty creative and critical power, both pop culture and academic culture cling to a sentimental vision of a scrappy corpus, succinct poems dashed off on recycled paper and candy wrappers. Indeed, Dickinson's reputation for small poetry and even smaller poetics still dominates to the extent that her own collections, the 40 hand-bound fascicles Dickinson wrote and compiled at the height of her productivity, remain understudied. Constructed by stacking handwritten folios and binding with a needle and thread, these zine-like booklets have no clear narrative, no titles, and no definite sequential order. Yet they contain about 800 works, nearly a third of her corpus, and essentially all of her most famous poems. While the scholarship that exists on the Fascicles has largely read them in terms of thematic ties between individual collections, or as a coherent compositional ethos as, quote, choosing not to choose, I suggest that Dickinson's Fascicles are connected both implicitly and non-linearly. In other words, the Fascicles are often treated like an herbarium, as composed of individual decontextualized fragments, or as a narrative poetry collection. But I propose a more rhizomatic approach. Like a rhizome, Dickinson's Fascicles function as a continuously growing horizontal underground stem, which puts out lateral shoots and adventitious roots at intervals. And you can see I have a little diagram of calla lily and the rhizomatic root system of the calla lily, which was a flower that Dickinson particularly enjoyed cultivating. Building off of the work of Kristan Miller and R.W. Franklin, I suggest that, similar to the poet's backyard plant beds, the Fascicles are a polished set of rearrangeable and intertwined text, which generate meaning through multi-directional accumulation, through recursive, sometimes contradictory poetic clusters, which take on the significance of sustained thought over time. The rhizomatic model I suggest accommodates for the variation of the Fascicles without losing sight of their interconnectivity. It invites readers to accept not unchecked possibility, a word Dickinson was so fond of, but a careful textual architecture of multiplicity, prioritizing the fraught experience of continuous thought and creation over the articulation of a singular specific point. Next slide. Today, I will present readings from Fascicles 18 and 23, tracking Dickinson's use of the phrase mechanic feet, and noting how her use of this phrase shifts across the two booklets. Fascicle 18 is a very pensive collection, full of Edenic landscapes, God, and passionate apostrophes to absent figures. Conversely, Fascicle 23 is audacious and playfully authoritative, defined by the speaker's unexpected power over looming figures like death and nature, as well as confident musings on her own spirituality. Though Fascicles 18 and 23 are neither adjacent nor logically continuous, Dickinson's repeated use of mechanic feet offers evidence of rich internal discussion, a common root. So here's some examples of the poems from those two Fascicles. And we can just look specifically at these two that we're going to be close reading today. So to be a little bit more specific, the sixth poem of Fascicle 23, which is entitled From Blank to Blank, and the 11th poem of Fascicle 18, which is entitled After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes, are linked by the shared phrase mechanic feet, and more broadly with their shared concern with the articulation of grief. In From Blank to Blank, Dickinson writes, from blank to blank, a threadless way I pushed mechanic feet, to stop or perish or advance alike indifferent. If end I gained, it ends beyond indefinite disclosed. I shut my eyes and groped as well, 'twas lighter to be blind. So in this segment, the unnamed speaker is narrating a spiritual crisis, a disorienting sense of aspirituality, which makes life feel, as she says, blank and directionless. Though they walk on, life is mechanic, because the speaker knows that all action seems equally in vain. Instead of seeking reassurance, the speaker acknowledges their discomfort, without hesitating to assert their morbid certainty that it ends beyond. They lament that it was lighter to be blind, but despite shutting their eyes in a desperate attempt at the end of the poem, they cannot return to a previous state of ignorance. Mechanic feet thus communicates a specific sense of depression and tetherlessness, which can perhaps be attributed to a loss of commitment to religious orthodoxy, similar to what we saw in our first panelist presentation today, I think. The phrase invokes estrangement both from the physical body and from a previous conception of the self. Feet, as opposed to any other part of the body, specifically suggest a futile journey, aimless motion rather than general detachment. Dickinson highlights the phrase mechanic feet with her use of metrical feet. Mechanic feet concludes the first complete grammatical phrase of the poem, ends a line, and also occupies 3 strong iambs. Fascicle 23, on the other hand, uses the same distinct phrase very differently. In After a Great Pain, a formal feeling comes, Dickinson begins, after a great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? The feet, mechanical, go round a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then letting go. So this poem is about the aftermath of bodily and physiological pain. Unlike From Blank to Blank, the speaker is moving along in a very clear forward progressing sequence. This is not a speaker who is dwelling in static, and immediately orients the reader in time with the prepositional phrase after great pain. The volta occurs in line 8 when the speaker shifts from describing sensation to narrating the passage of time, and eventually resolving this narrative with a cathartic speech act, then letting go. All of stanza 2 describes the feet mechanical. Once again, 3 iambs create a powerful rhythmic momentum. Go round invokes the hands of a clock. It's a shrewd play on words, as the stanza only covers a few lines, and it functions to transport the reader from the moment immediately after loss to the memory of that hour of lead, now outlived. At a glance, From Blank to Blank and After a Great Pain, a formal feeling comes appear to have different interests. But following the lexical thread of mechanic feet, a relationship between these 2 poems emerges. When paired, the focal point of these poems moves away from the source of injury that they describe to Dickinson's ability to challenge the language with which that emotion is articulated. The weary confidence in nothingness and the undertone of fear that it obscures in From Blank to Blank is kin to the cool numbness of After a Great Pain, a formal feeling comes, because they both engage in the same conversation about the explication of grief. On the level of the 2 fascicles, this reading of Mechanic Feet invites the reading of 2 collections together. Even as Fascicle 18 is characterized by yearning, while 23 exercises a hyperbolic and even desperate sense of power. The rhizomic root of Mechanical Feet invites a dialogue about grief between these 2 poems and between the 2 collections. The articulation of grief provides a broader stroke of coherence here, connecting parts of the fascicles which have no otherwise shared vocabulary or obvious overlap. And here's those 2 poems again for you. Let's see, yeah. Now we'll turn to my slide to consider these 2 fascicles from a bird's eye view. Though because I could not stop for death, and my faith is larger than the hills, both from Fascicle 23, and you can see a list of first lines of all the poems in 23 and all the poems in 18 here. Let's see. So though both because I could not stop for death and my faith is larger than the hills, both from 23, exercise a self-reliant strength that cannot be found in the lonesome I envy seas whereon he rides and 'twas the old road through pain, both as you can see from Fascicle 18. These groups of poems within a rhizomatic reading or a garden reading seem like iterative attempts at the same goal, which is to narrate the paradoxes of healing, whether from loss of faith, of health, or of a beloved. Through this example, we glimpse how the fascicles might benefit from being considered holistically as a project composed of rearrangeable clusters, 40 independent book systems that obsessively agitate, resolve, and re-agitate each other. Garden reading highlights seemingly minute phrases, continually drawing out new configurations of meaning from the same poems and fascicles by finding new paths among them. By analyzing the fascicles as intentionally constructed entities, Readers both affirm Dickinson's forethought as an ambitious writer and make an intellectual investment in the connections between the fascicle books without insisting on an artificial sequence. Mechanic Feet is a small example, drawing on only 2 books and barely scratching the surface of potential for garden reading to elucidate the fascicles more broadly. Unlike other poets, Dickinson's corpus does not contain lists of discretely titled collections, at least not one that she herself determined, or even a table of contents that places her poems in order. An issue that pervades the study of many women authors and can undermine our attempts to understand these creative processes. When the fascicles break apart into individual poems, the reputation for smallness from which the study of Dickinson writing already suffers is reproduced. Reading rhizomatically, or through garden reading, on the other hand, emphasizes the ways in which meaning accumulates through the fascicles, suggesting not an individual or pithy moral, but the ways in which Dickinson attempts to experience the problems of thought, emotion, and art. When read as gardens, the poems in the fascicles, When read as gardens, poetry in the fascicles becomes a way to practice thinking as Dickinson hones the format of her questions. By tracing examples of synthesis across poems and fascicles, readers can practice understanding Dickinson's corpus systematically. After so many decades of considering the fascicles primarily as functional storage units or archives, I hope that the time has come to place them once again at the center of Dickinson's career, to lean into the discomfort of their at times frustrating ambiguity, and to trust in their ability to guide us through Dickinson's poetry on her own organizational terms. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mila. It's so creative. I love that rhizomic reading of her. And I feel like the 3 papers today have all the, they're so interconnected on so many different levels. Dickinson is a gardener, a poet, naturalist, scientist, and someone who is also methodical about her own poetic curation there. Beautiful. Now I believe we are perfectly on time. So also the panel sort of started a bit late. So I think we probably have a good 10 minutes or so for questions, if there is any. There are also a bunch of comments already in the chat. So do feel free to respond to any of that. Ivy, would you like to go ahead if you have any question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So, Mila, I love that paper, and I'm all 3 of the papers, but I have a specific question for Mila, which is a clarification. Are you using rhizomatic reading and garden reading interchangeably? Because it seems to me that rhizomatic reading, the gardens really are about human agency interacting with the natural world, whereas rhizomes seem so much more naturally occurring. You don't need a gardener to produce a rhizome. Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm just wondering if you're making a distinction between those two. I mean, they're amazingly resonant ways of thinking about reading the fascicles, which I totally agree with you, have been underread and are connected in very unusual ways. So that's my question for you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really insightful point. I think in this paper, I'm using them pretty much interchangeably, but I agree that there's definitely the sort of connotative meanings of the 2 words are quite different. I think that my original gut instinct was to use rhizomatic reading throughout, and I think that one better reflects the ideas in the paper. But I was a little bit concerned, especially when I was drafting this and sort of had gone through a couple of different just reconstruction processes, that rhizomatic would be less accessible because not as many people know what it means, and that garden reading sounds a bit catchier. Not that catchiness really matters in this context, but when I only have, maybe 5 to 15 minutes to explain a big idea, I was like, maybe it's easier to just go with garden reading because this is something that people have a bit more context for. But it's great to hear that the ideas are coming through clearly enough that you are like noticing that distinction, and maybe I can just use rhizomatic reading throughout, and I don't have to worry quite so much about potentially confusing my readers. So thank you for that question. And I think the simple answer is that rhizomatic reading is the way to go. And I appreciate the question.
Great. Peric?
So I've got a question for Beverley. Really loved your paper, and I just would like to ask you a little bit about George Eliot and Mila and the Floss and the flood and poor Tom and Maggie dying, but in this eternal embrace that means that they'll live on forever in the story. I just wondered if you thought about Mila and the Floss and that very famous flood that I think meant a lot to Dickinson.
I hadn't actually, and I don't know too much George Eliot, but that's interesting to think about the mill as well, because that's something that comes up in the flood poems and is in some of the it's in some of the biblical passages linking was mill part of what you mentioned?
Yes, so it's all about a mill on a river.
Okay, yes. Yeah, that's interesting because the mill has come up in some of the flood poems. So I didn't know about the George Eliot, but it's in the Bible as well, in these passages that I talked about where they depict the flood's victims as the precursors of these people who are going to get left behind at the resurrection. And they say, people, like everybody was going about their business. The miller was standing there, and then the one who was a believer got taken up to heaven and the rapture, and then the one who wasn't stayed at the mill. And so she was always wondering in the flood poems if she's going to be left behind. And that's sort of linked to the whole thing. So that's interesting to know the Eliot context.
You should definitely read Mill and the Floss.
Huh.
It's my favorite George Eliot novel. It's got a very sad ending, but I think it would fit into the things that you're thinking about. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sounds perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I also have a sort of a follow-up question, maybe, Beverly, because I'm thinking about your last PowerPoint where you talk about the connection of your reading catastrophism and Unitarianism, and then later on you talk about the Anthropocene, its relevance to that's kind of a narrow linear trajectory towards a potential catastrophic ending. So I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about that in terms of Dickinson's outlook. In what way do you think his flood poems might be related to that Anthropocene allegory or the Anthropocene crisis we're going through right now?
Right. Yeah, some of the poems there was in terms of her outlook on it, she definitely brings in some interesting perspective, from this standpoint, not only from catastrophism, but also from the Bible, where these ecological disasters are punishments. And so she deals with that in this poem, Winters Are So Short, where she links the flood to climate change, because in Hitchcock's reading, Genesis was, I think in Hitchcock's reading, seasonal change, or at least like sterility, was a consequence of the fall, and before that, everything was fertile. So she does link it to changing temperatures a lot, which are interesting for now. And she also thinks about how, in a kind of prescient way, I guess, this other poem, Glee, the Great Storm is Over, how if, there was no God behind things like the flood, it wouldn't be justified. It'd just be a senseless tragedy. So that's interesting to think about from this perspective too, is now we're crossing this and there's no kind of redeeming factor there.
Great. I wonder whether it's also possible to invite Alexandra to sort of comment a bit on the discussion here, because I think there's already a chat box discussion about Dickinson's herbarium and her poetic practice, her role as a gardener. And in our previous panels, there also talks about her mushrooms, right, and her mycelium thinking. And then we also have Peter's talk about the herbarium and so on. Would you like to respond to any of that here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the herbarium is one of those things that is sort of still, in a way, understood as like a separate work in contrast to her poetry. So we think of her poetry and we think of like, oh, facsimiles and the thousands of poems and the organization of them, but we tend to look at the herbarium as something that was already sort of organized and finished, and therefore does not create that sort of, doesn't have that sort of mysticism around it. Like it was not a secret, it wasn't hidden, it wasn't found or discovered, right? So we tend to have it as sort of like a separate, maybe complementary piece of her work that is not like, I don't know, like it's somehow harder to see it as part of poetic work. And it is, because we can look at the two of them together, and proof of that is that there are some collections that have already like collected poems that mention flowers or plants that she mentions in her herbarium. And that is a very like sort of beginner approach to the herbarium as a text that is worthy of being studied as part of poetic work. But I think there are always ways to go further with that, because we tend, like collectively, I think as readers, we tend to fall very easily into the, I don't want to say trap, but maybe the sort of easiness of like simplifying a figure that is as complex and sort of just complex to sort of grasp as Dickinson is. So not only is her poetry sometimes a little bit obscure, but the rest of her work also as scientist, because her herbarium is differs a little bit from other herbaria at the time, including in the arrangement and labeling of these specimens. And the way that she puts together seasonal flowers with perennial flowers and perennial plants with sort of like just herbs and all sorts of things that wouldn't often be categorized together. So she was not separating her specimens in like, oh, flowers, seasonal flowers here and perennial flowers here. And she wasn't doing that. She was creating arrangements with pressed flowers that is not something very common. And the labeling now, especially now with the scientific progress that has happened in the last century, we know that some of those specimens were mislabeled. And we don't know if they were like accidentally or intentionally mislabeled. Doesn't really matter at this point. But now that we know that, it adds another layer of complexity to that school project that no one really tends to think about that much. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think it's something that has to continue to be explored.
Wonderful. Thank you all for such thoughtful responses and productive conversation. And now I think our next panelists are already here. So can you join me and thank the three presenters for this wonderful session? And since we started 10 minutes late, I wonder whether we will